job.
Uh-huh.
And they had checked with him on references afterwards, but I didn't want it aired around that I was seeking a job. I wanted to hold one job until I got another one.
Sure.
But the move to Scottsbluff was the best one I made, and because I went to work for, it was owned in those days by the Wisner family, and Mr. Wisner was one of the finest people I've ever known. Was a very, even then he was getting up in years, but he was one of the most, for those days, he was one of the kindest, most enlightened. He believed in paying his people a living wage.
Mm-hmm.
And the paper was well run and prospering. And that's where I had become acquainted with Maxine. We'd been going together. She worked for the North Platte Telegraph and as a assistant bookkeeper, and we had gotten acquainted and had dated. And anyway, after I went to Scottsbluff, she and I got married that summer. And we rented a furnished apartment there in Scottsbluff, and I worked there until I was called into the service.
And you were married June
In 1940,
30th?
June 30th, 1940.
Mm-hmm.
Well, the war was in progress, and it wasn't after a couple of years. Well, in January 18, 1942, our first daughter, Cheryl Ann, was born in the old Methodist Hospital downtown, which was a hospital right in the downtown section of Scottsbluff. And of course, we thought she was the greatest thing that had ever happened to us. Anyway, she was a little girl when I was called into service, and she and Maxine went to North Platte. Bless Grandpa and Grandma Guthrie. They looked after her. I went to her and Maxine. Maxine went to work for a drugstore and was a cosmetic counter sales lady and so forth, and assistant bookkeeper for them. And anyway, they looked after Sherry and Maxine while I was gone. I took my basic training in the armored school at Fort Knox, Kentucky. And after I got through with my basic training, I came back to North Platte on a delay en route and saw my folks who had by that time had moved over onto the farm near Plainview. Had gotten moved over there, and James had come back, who was with them. And I went immediately was sent to the staging area at Fort Meade, Maryland. Was there a few weeks for processing, and then they sent us up to Camp Shanks, New York, which is about 40 miles up the Hudson from New York City. Was there about 6 weeks waiting for a convoy to form, and traveled. We went across in a big convoy with a lot of escort because submarines were still active. German subs were still active, and we went across, and the convoy came down above Ireland into the Irish Sea, and we landed at Liverpool. And that was seeing Liverpool was the first time I'd ever seen bombing destruction, because it had been heavily bombed in 1940 and 41, all through those early years before we had gotten into the war. Mm-hmm. And we went down across Wales into southern England, to a camp in southern England. That's the big staging area. All southern England was a staging area for the invasion. And I can remember the invasion of Normandy started, the assaults on Omaha and Utah beaches started on June the 6th, 1944, as most people would remember. we had been in our camp there only about 3 days, I guess, and we knew that things were happening. And we heard the planes, thousands of planes going over and coming back at night. And I can remember the day of the invasion. We had, they were giving us orientation and training and so forth, and we watched the huge flights of planes that were, they were towing supply. By that time the beach was secured early, and they were dropping gliders in on the beaches with supplies and even some personnel. Most of the personnel that went in from the air went in at night, dropped in behind the beaches at night, and took up a counteraction for the invading, for the beach forces. And then we saw thousands and thousands of planes through the days, watching them. They would go round the clock, back and forth, dropping bombs in support of the fighting, the beach operations and so forth. We were there, I was there until several places. They moved us around, they moved us closer to the beach.
What was your division? What were you
Well,
called?
later I joined I was a replacement.
Uh-huh.
I was going as a replacement with a big replacement outfit.
I see.
And these were replacement depots that we were going through. I went across the channel. We went on shipboard across. We left from Weymouth, the port of Weymouth, and we crossed the channel on a troop ship, and then we were loaded onto landing craft, regular landing craft, to go. We landed. The group I was with landed at Utah Beach, and we were trucked then around to a place back of Omaha Beach. And we were there until, well, we later moved up. We kept moving right behind the Army. And
What was your rank in that service
I was a private at that time.
at that time? Mm-hmm.
And we followed on, we moved up. The next move we made after we had been at the Omaha Beach area, the breakthrough came. We watched the big bombing at St. Lo, and the next move we moved down to St. Lo. The replacement camp would just move. We were in pup tents anyway. And we moved on down. We kept following along behind until, guys were being called out and sent, assigned to replace.
Mm-hmm.
As people were injured and killed and so forth, why, you went in as a replacement. And I was with them along with the replacement. Apparently, they didn't need me very badly. Well, the war went well, after the breakthrough. And went down the last, I remember I was south of Paris. Our replacement camp was south of Paris at the time that Paris was taken. Then we had a big, long move. Things were moving awfully fast. The German army kind of collapsed there for a little bit, and lots of prisoners taken, hundreds of thousands of prisoners, several hundred thousand. And they were retreating. And so there was not much, when you're moving that rapidly, the casualties are not particularly great. And finally, the last replacement depot camp that we were in was up in Belgium, not far from St. Vith, which is the famous, where the breakthrough later came through during the Bulge. But it was while I was up there in northern Belgium that I was assigned to the 5th Armored Division. They were in Luxembourg, and several of us, they had suffered some casualties, and several of us were assigned. And I went to a tank crew as a bow gunner with in this tank crew in the 5th Armored Division. They had lost about 3 tanks in one day. And so they had to have crews. And so I went in as a crewman on a tank. And I was with the tank crew. We were in Luxembourg, and then we were in northern Belgium, and we took part in the battle for the Hurtgen Forest, which was a prolonged, tremendously prolonged battle and a very costly one. And we were in the Hurtgen Forest at the time that the Germans mounted their Ardennes offensive, which was a concentrated drive just to the south of us. And what our forces did, they transferred us to another army and pulled us back. We were actually in Germany, in the Hurtgen Forest, and they pulled us back from that area. We were down almost to the Rohr River. And they pulled us back from there and assigned us as a flanking movement on the north flank near Eupen to keep the Germans from fanning out. They were coming through as a spearhead, and they had gotten as far as Bastogne, and we were positioned with forces on the north flank to keep them from spreading, going north to Antwerp, because their goal was to split us and go to Antwerp, which was the big port city in Belgium, which we were using by that time extensively. But fortunately, the troops held at Bastogne. Bastogne held. Patton's army came from the south. We, of course, held at the north, and we pinched off the Bulge. The Bulge actually lasted for a number of weeks, good number of weeks, and we finally pinched off. Our forces were committed in a final pinch off in Belgium, in Germany. By that time we moved back into Germany, and we were assigned in a final pinch off of the Bulge, the German offensive, in late January. And I can remember the attack we made in a blizzard that day. The snow was 2 or 3 feet deep, and we made a final attack during a big blizzard. And from then on, we went to, after the Bulge, our division was then attached to the 9th Army. And we made the attack in the spring that carried us down to the Rhine. And we waited at the Rhine for a number of weeks because all the bridges had been blown. The famous Remagen Bridge was south of us, and that's the one that our forces had captured, and it held up for a few days to let a bridgehead go across, and then it finally collapsed. We were to the north, and we crossed on a pontoon bridge across the Rhine. They had flown gliders ahead of us, dropped troops ahead of us, and they put in a pontoon bridge, and we took our tanks across the Rhine on a pontoon bridge. And then we just took off across late March, early April, across northern Germany. And when we got up about to as far as they were going, I had been asked if I would, they were short, that we lost lots of officers during the Bulge, and I was asked if I would, my platoon leader recommended me for an OCS course, officer training course, which was had been set up back in France to train officers for replacement purposes. Mm-hmm. And most of the people that went back there were people like myself who had been through a couple of campaigns. And so, in late April, middle April, the first sergeant came up.
Would have been what year?
1945.
Mhm.
Came up and said, hey, you're on orders to go back to France. And he picked me up and took me to a point, and I went back on a truck across the Rhine and got on a train and at Brussels, Belgium, and went to Paris and down south of Paris to an officer candidate school in an old French officers training area, and that's where I took my OCS. And after I got out of that, by the war had ended in Europe at that time, and we were all figuring we'd have to go to Japan.
And your rank was
Second lieutenant.
second lieutenant.
And we were there until, got plenty of time?
Mhm.
We were there at that camp until early June. And then we were sent back into Germany and assigned to a replacement depot, again, out near Marburg. And I was, why don't you shut it off for a moment?
Okay, we just had a slight interruption with phone call.
I realize that I'm running on and didn't intend to, but I get wound up and I'm glad to stay with it.
And where were we?
Well, that first summer of 45, I was assigned to, as a platoon leader with the 36th Infantry Division in southern Germany, the Black Forest area of southern Germany. And while I was there, the big news came. We were just engaged in training exercises and so forth, and all of us figured that maybe we were going to have to go to Japan. That was the whole idea. And all the troops in Europe figured that we were going to have to go to the invasion, make an invasion in Japan.
Mm-hmm.
But, as everybody knows, they dropped the bomb. The war in the Pacific had moved along and satisfactorily, and they dropped the atomic bomb on Japan. And I can remember how amazed, how awestruck we were when we heard that we had an atomic bomb and that it had been dropped. And we knew, the speculation was that it would be over quickly, and it was. It took a second bomb to drop. I think the first one was at Hiroshima, and the second one went at Nagasaki. I believe that's the sequence. It might have been the other sequence, but anyway, it brought that war to a conclusion. And immediately they started sending troops home. The 36th Division had been in combat from the time that in North Africa, and so they had a large turnover of people. Yes, they'd had tremendous suffered. They had taken part in the Italian campaign and had lost tremendous numbers of people. And so many of them there were still a few who were originals from the North African campaign, but most of them had been replaced through the years. And anyway, all of them had enough points to go home, and the older ones, the ones that had been with them a long time. I had enough points to come home if I were an enlisted man, but I didn't have enough as an officer. So anyway, I stayed.
What do you mean by points?
Points. They sent you home according to how many points you had built up through combat, how long you'd been over there, and so forth. And so I had enough points to come home as an enlisted, if I'd have been an enlisted man, but by that time I was an officer and it took more points. And so I stayed, and they assigned me, the 36th Infantry Division was sent home, sent back to the States. Naturally, they didn't have to go to Japan, so they sent them back to the States. And they were setting up their occupation forces, and I was assigned as a junior officer out of the replacement depot then. I went back to a replacement depot, and they assigned me to a prisoner of war camp as a second officer, as a junior officer at a prisoner of war camp at near Mannheim. at a little town called Lampertine. And they had set up these were scattered all over Germany, West Germany. And we had about 350 German prisoners of war, and including some former SS troops. Barbed wire enclosures and so forth, guard towers and that sort of thing. The engineers had set it up. And there were only about eight American personnel, 2 officers and 6 enlisted men. And the guard duty was done by Polish displaced persons, former Polish army personnel. They had been in prison camps back when Poland was overrun in 1939. And they had been in some of the prison camps and concentration camps, and they were afraid to go home because the communists had taken over by that time in Poland, and frankly they were afraid to go home, and with good reason, because they were shipping them, they were taking them, grabbing them off, and either killing them or sending them to Siberia. The Russians were. So in order to send more troops home, they put our army, put uniforms on these people, dyed uniforms, and organized them into guard details. And they guarded the German prisoners of war and served as guards around the warehouses, American warehouses and so forth, army warehouses. So I was there a month or so that fall until the captain who was in charge, who was my senior in the camp, was transferred to a supervisory position in an area, not just a camp, but the area. They were moving out. It was actually a job for a colonel, and he was sent there to be in charge of the area, and that left me as the junior only officer out there, and I became the commanding officer. And I was there until along in January. They started disbanding the small camps like the one where we were, and I was transferred then over to the area headquarters and assigned in a liaison in the setup. I was an assistant to the liaison officer that worked with the Polish Guard units. And so I was there until June. I got to come home. And as a liaison, and I worked with the Polish officers, the former Polish officers who are now serving as officers in these guard units and so forth. I worked with them, and I found it very interesting. I learned a great deal about their trials and tribulations as prisoners of war, and the treatment that they had received from both Russians and Germans, and I got quite an education. I became good friends with some of them, and it was an interesting time for me. I came home, got back home, and back to the States, and was
this was June
released.
What?
In 46,
46.
June of 46.
And you were there from what to what?
I was there from May 1944 until June 1946.
2 years in the service.
2 years. I mean, over there.
Yeah.
Well, I was longer in the service than that, but
Yeah.
that didn't include my, time in the States.
Sure.
So, actually, I wasn't in a full 3 years, but I was in a...
Were you drafted or did you join?
I was drafted.
I
I was drafted.
Mm-hmm.
Was one of the first to be drafted with children,
Mm-hmm.
When they got started. I had a low draft number, and by the time they started taking kids, people with fathers with children, I was one of the first to go in the county. But anyway, after I came back to North Platte, I should have taken a job right away, but I didn't. I had some reason, I've done a lot of stupid things. I had the idea that I wanted to go out to the Northwest. And anyway, I waited around all summer, and I must say that my in-laws put up with me. In September, I went with Virgil, my brothers, Virgil and Marvin, on a trip up through Wyoming, Montana, Idaho, into Washington, and I was applying for jobs. And I took a job at Spokane, Washington, with the Spokesman Review and Chronicle, and I worked there as an ad man for a few months. Should have stayed, really. I was getting along pretty good, but I wasn't very happy. I wasn't happy in a big town. It was a city.
Mom and I had moved up with you at that time.
Mom and Sherry had moved out there. Well, we lived in a slum. Really, we did. We lived in a slum area, and there wasn't much you could do about it. Housing was terribly hard to get. It was right after the war. We lived in an ex-workers area, and that had been rented to them. Oh, it was miserable.
That's my first remembering.
Yes, it was pretty much of a
I
slum.
remember an old wood stove.
Wood stove and
Black wood stove,
yep,
and I don't.
we cooked with coal, and we had wooden sidewalks, and
Thin
neighbors,
walls,
paper
thin
walls, and so forth. Anyway, I got an invitation they had put the two papers together in Northwest, and I got an inquiry, would I be interested in coming back there and going to work for them as an ad salesman. And I took the job. So we moved back to Northwest. And it was hard to get a place to live there, too, especially with a child. But we did. We lived there until along in May. And the Wisners from Scottsbluff came to me and said, we're thinking about buying the paper, the weekly paper, semi-weekly paper at Shadman.
This was what year?
This was in 47.
Mm-hmm.
I was working at the North Platte Telegraph at that time. It had been put together. Would you be interested? And we'll put you on a commission basis. I mean, a share the profit basis. And you can use what you get to buy stock.
Mm-hmm.
So anyway, I took the job. And we went up there. And it was a rough time. It was a rough go. The equipment had been hard to get, and it wasn't well equipped to begin with, and the equipment was old and failing, and had needed to be replaced, but wasn't. And
This was the Shadden record.
this was the Shadron record,
Mm-hmm.
and I struggled. Help was hard to get too. But anyway, to make a long story short, we managed somehow, and things got better. And we were there 10 years. And Mary was born in April the 4th, 1950, in the little Shadron Municipal Hospital.
Mary Louise.
Mary Louise. And Sherry was going to school. She had started kindergarten at the Kenwood School the first fall we were there. And I can see her yet. taking her up to school and getting her started and so forth. Anyway, Mary came along, and we got along. We had it was never easy. We never made the money that we'd like to have made, but in the 10 years that we were there, I did manage to pay off what the Wisners had owed on the paper, because they bought it with a down payment.
Mm-hmm.
Paid off what they owed on it, and I managed to acquire a 25% interest in it. And then they were never real happy with what they were getting out of it either. And Frank Wisner wanted to go to California. California was booming, and he wanted to go to California, and he wanted his money, naturally, out of what he had there. And so we agreed to sell it, and in 1957, we sold it. And we sold it to a fellow from Kansas who had a couple of, he had some money, and his wife had some couple of wheat farms, and small wheat farms, and they, later on, that helped them to pay it off. But it was a good sale, and I had, Maxine and I had gotten ahead. I went back to the Star Herald in Scottsbluff, and
Became
later on, after a couple of years, I became the editor of the Star Herald, the news editor of the Star Herald in 1960, and I was the news editor until 1966, and it was that was an interesting time for me. I know that I thought I was overworked and so forth, and I think I was, but I enjoyed the fact
But you were
of the
also a
prestige.
workaholic.
And yes, I acquired I was always accused of being a workaholic, and I guess maybe I was. Anyway, I was with the Star Herald then until '66. Then I tried selling mutual funds for a while, but that didn't work out. I got my license, and I tried to sell mutual funds, and quite frankly, I wasn't making it. So I looked around for another job. It seemed that whenever I wanted to change jobs, it was always tough to do. But I went to work for the Business Farmer in Scottsbluff, and it kept me there. We owned our home there, and it was better than every time you move, it cost you money. So I worked for the Business Farmer for about 2.5 years, and this job opening came up with the Public Relations Director at Nebraska Farm Bureau Federation in Lincoln. A number of people who were Farm Bureau members knew me out there and had become acquainted with me, and they really recommended me. My predecessor here in Lincoln had been killed in an auto accident. And so I applied for the job, and I got the job. And under the circumstances, one of the best moves I ever made, because during those years, apparently they were satisfied with me. I was with them 13 years. And during that time, I edited their paper for them, and the Farm Bureau paper, and did their radio broadcasts, especially over KRVN at Lexington, and a number of other stations that we supplied tapes to. And also did a lot of reporting concerning the legislature. I had a daily broadcast over KRVN during the legislative session, during the days that the legislature was in session. And I learned a lot about the legislature and how bills are passed and the skullduggery that goes into it.
Mm-hmm.
And not very proud of all the things that I participated in, but I think I satisfied my employer, and I worked hard, and everything turned out pretty well. I retired in November 1982. You had to retire at 65.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm thankful that we were able to. I always figured that I would probably have to work after I retired. But we had enough. They had a good retirement program, and I have been retired over 8 years now, and I have enjoyed that time, enjoyed relatively good health, and have not had to work. That's the story of my working activities. Our children grew up. Maxine worked for had worked and helped me a great deal at Shadron, in the Shadron Record. She served and pinch hit many many positions. She had kept the books at times. She sold classified advertising for us. And she also sold some display advertising for us. And she could just fill in very capably where we needed her. In the final years there, she worked virtually full time. We had good help in looking after, having somebody look after the kids when they were in school, and Mary was tiny. They had good people looking after them, girls that we thought a great deal of, and that were good to the kids, and we really looked after them. So I don't think we shorted the kids anything, in any way. Sherry graduated after we went to Gearing. She graduated from Gearing High School. She had her final 3 years at Gearing. And Mary went all of her, she started kindergarten in Chadron and had her first grade in Chadron. But then she went the rest of the way in school in Gearing and graduated from Gearing High School and went a year to Nebraska Western College at Scotts Bluff. Sherry got married to Dick Blaha, and they lived in Laramie originally while he finished his last year in university. Then they lived in Denver for a few years, and we used to enjoy going over to Denver and visiting them.
Going up in the mountains.
Yep. And their son Jeff was born in Denver, and then they went on to Minnesota, and were up there while we were. Some of the time, after we came here to Lincoln, they lived at Thief River Falls, Minnesota. We used to enjoy going up there and visiting them, and we would have Jeff and Connie come down and stay with us a week or two, a couple of weeks in the summertime. And we enjoyed always having the grandkids come and visit in those summers. And generally, it's been a relatively good. We can't complain about our life at all. Life has been good to us. We've had our health problems, but so does everybody. And generally, I enjoy my playing golf, and Maxine enjoys her bridge companions, and we're getting along fine. And we enjoy our children and grandchildren, and now our great-grandchildren. So that's about the story. Not a very exciting story. I'm not unhappy with my life, and I'm proud of some of the things I've done, and some of the things that I'm not very proud of, I'm not going to talk about. So
I can't imagine.
That's
I
about
can't think
the
of
size of
any. I can't think of any.
Oh yes, there have been some that weren't so good, but anyway, anything as a wind-up that you want to ask? I think I've thrown in everything but the kitchen sink. Gone on for over an hour and a half. An hour and a half.
Yeah.
And you can cut out anything you want to. I'm sure that it has gone on much too long. But that's it for this time. Thank you.
Well, I won't cut a thing.